Hi students, welcome back into another video lecture. So we are continuing our discussion on natural resources. Water is very important, as we know. Life has originated in water only, and no organism can survive without water. And this planet Earth is blessed with the water, and therefore there is a life existing here in millions and millions of different forms. Therefore, water resource becomes one of the important things to discuss, and in this session we are going to know how important the water resource is and what is the condition of our water resource, and how to protect it from getting polluted or from getting depleting from the available water resources. Let's take up the next slide. Mainly the water resource what we have is in the form of the rivers, lakes and ponds, and most of the rivers we are utilizing for the need of the water, and it is mainly by constructing the dams. So let's take up the dams first. In this topic we are going to learn about the dams, their benefits and problems. Water is a renewable resource, and we know that it constitutes the hydrosphere. Dams and reservoirs help us in power generation, flood control and irrigation. These are the purposes why we construct the dams. Now, the use of the water, what we are utilizing, the way in which we are utilizing the water are so many, other than our household use and drinking purpose and all, cleaning purpose. Other than that, for irrigation, navigation and generation of the electricity, also we are using the water. And even the water-based industries also make use of lot of water, where the water may be used as a coolant or solvent or a cleaning liquid, or making some beverages like cold drinks and other beverages, fermented beverages, and all that the water is being used. Even in the industries like leather industries, everywhere this water is being utilized, and as a coolant it is used in thermal power stations, in nuclear power stations. So water has got lot of uses. The actual fact is 97.5% of the Earth's water is in oceans and seas. We know that Earth's surface, around 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with the water, and that's a huge amount of water which is there in the oceans and seas, and that constitute 97.5% of the total water, which we cannot use directly because it is highly saline, salty. The remaining just 2.5% is the soft water, or the fresh water we call, which we the humans and all other organisms living on land are making use of. Let us see further that this 2.5%, out of that, most of it, you can say 1.97% of the fresh water is frozen. It is in the form of the ice in the polar region and on the mountain peaks, where the ice is there in the form of the solid water, we can say. And 0.5% of the groundwater is available to us, that is under the earth, the storage of the water table and all, from where we can extract the water by bore wells. And then only 0.02% is available to us in the form of lakes and rivers. So further, soil stores a little amount, like 0.01% of water, that is called as moisture of the soil, and also in the atmosphere as humidity, 0.0001% of water is seen. So this is how the water is distributed on the earth. So reality is only 0.02% of the fresh water is actually available to us. Now this water resource is a renewable resource because it is continuously being replenished in the form of the water cycle. What is water cycle? Let us look into that. You might have studied before also in lower classes that the water from the surface of the oceans and seas as well as from the rivers evaporates, and when the evaporated water, as we know, contains only H2O, that is pure water, and these water vapors in gaseous form, when they reach the troposphere around 6 to 10 kilometers above the sea level, there it gets condensed into the clouds, and these clouds are formed not only by the water evaporating from the seas and inland waters, but also the forests contribute to it by the way of transpiration, and also from the soil. Some of the water from the soil moisture also evaporates and joins the clouds after condensation, and these clouds are moved by the winds, and we see that when it rains from the clouds, the rain will be falling on both the ocean as well as on the land. Much of the water percolates into the land and goes and joins to the water which is under the earth's surface, which is in the form of table water or aquifer, and a lot of rain which is falling on to the hills and mountains, that will be trickling down and joining the inland rivers and lakes, and these rivers and lakes ultimately they join the ocean, and again from the ocean the water evaporates and forms the clouds, and this cycle continues, and that's how the water resource is replenished continuously, and we are getting the water for our needs. Now, but one thing is very clear, that the fresh water which we are using is very, very little compared to the huge amount of water available on this earth. Of course, that huge amount of water in the form of oceans and seas is forming the hydrosphere. There millions and millions of aquatic animals are living and surviving. It is their world. So we are living on the land, and therefore we utilize inland water, fresh water only. Now let's take up the utilization of water, how we are utilizing it, whether we are over-utilization is going on, and if it is over-utilization or exploitation of water resource, what are the problems we are going to face. Now the dams which we are constructing and trying to retain the water, not allowing it to go and join the sea, and that is how we are trying to get much of the water, inland water, available for our different purposes. As demand for the water has been increased because of the population explosion. As the human population is increasing, the demand has increased and demand of the food has increased. So for increasing the agriculture products, we have to go for irrigation of the open land, and barren lands can be converted into the agricultural fields with the help of irrigation, supplying the water from the stored reservoirs like dams. And we know that the water is also needed for generating electricity, that is in hydroelectric power stations, and further the utilization of water has increased because of the industrialization, then urbanization, and further the water, whatever is available to us, that is also not safe today because human activities have polluted it. Much of it is polluted. According to some data, around 70% of the India's surface water is said to be polluted, and polluted water leads to waterborne diseases. Let's talk about the floods. The outflow of water, let us go to this definition. The outflow of water which fails to accommodate within the banks of the channels results in spreading of excess water over the adjoining areas. So this is what called as flood. So we have discussed about the flood in earlier lecture also. Now let us see what are the effects of the floods in the past, what has happened, like in the period of 1987 to 2000 in Asian continent alone. We see that approximately 237,000 people have lost their lives because of the floods, because when it floods, it enters into the villages, into the cities around nearby the water body and submerges everything, and many people get drowned and their properties are destroyed. So in last century, if you look at China's Huanghu River flooded devastatingly, and around 6 million people have lost their lives. Now let us take up the types of floods. Floods can be classified into around 4 different types. Like first one, we call it as the rainfall floods, due to heavy rainfall, of course, and then dam failure floods. Sometimes when the dams are full and the amount of water in the dam crosses the maximum level, danger level, and if the dam construction has not been so strong, sometimes it happens that wall of the dam may crack open, and it leads to the flood. That's what called as the dam flood or dam failure flood. And then the third one is the melting of ice, as because nowadays we see that global warming is very much there, and due to global warming what happens is temperature of the Earth's atmosphere is increasing, and due to global warming ice from the polar regions as well as from the mountain peaks is melting and trickling down in the form of a kind of flood. So that's also called as the melting of ice flood. And then the last one is sudden release of the impounded water. Impounded water is the water which is contained in the reservoirs and dams, and sometimes what happens when the water level is reaching the danger level or maximum level which the dam can accommodate, so then the dam authorities, the administrative officers, they have to take a decision to release some of the water into the river, and sometimes sudden release of this impounded water may overflood the river and cause destruction to the nearby areas around the river. So such kind of the floods are called as sudden release of impounded water. Now therefore floods result in not only destruction to human lives and the properties, but to the nature also it causes harm, because as the water runs on the surface of water for miles and miles together, so it carries away along with it the topsoil, so it causes the soil erosion, and somewhere it dumps the soil or the silt as a sedimentation in the rivers and channels, and also the reservoirs, and that adversely affect again the dams and reservoirs, and the flood becomes again taking place in future. Then remedies for floods. How to solve this problem of the flood? So first of all, we should know the proper, exact, or I can say accurate meteorological information we should have, that is the weathercast, and if we could know that precisely at which day or at what time when the flood is going to occur or most probably expected. At that moment, the people can be made aware of, and people can move away from the plain areas nearby rivers to up hills, and they can be safe. And that's one thing. We should have a precise forecast of the weather. And then the other ways are reforestation, construction of small flood storage dams in the valleys, and the control floods, which controls the floods, and as well as the soil erosion. So what is the small flood storage dams? Let us say wherever the natural valleys are there, so there the water can be collected. Whenever the excess water is released from the dam, it can be directed into that valley, or whenever there is a flood, that can be channelized towards that valley where it gets collected, and minimizing therefore the soil erosion, and that water can be further used also. Of course, planting trees is one of the best method. Along the banks of the river, we should have the tall, vast canopy having, larger canopy having big trees which we can plant on the other side of the bank, and that will help in preventing the flood, as the plants hold the topsoil and do not allow soil erosion. Now let us take up drought. As we know that droughts are the period of the year, or sometimes many years, when there is very minimum rainfall, lower than what is actually required. So that leads to drought, hot climatical condition. The product of agriculture also decreases. Drinking water availability becomes scarce, and people will be suffering from famine, that is inavailability of the food, and people may die out due to hunger. So such drought conditions, drought actually is caused by failure of the monsoon and irregularity in the rainfall. And the other reasons for drought is overgrazing, because overgrazing will lead to the soil erosion, and of course when the vegetation is less, it has indirect effect on the atmosphere and rainy season. Then limitless agriculture activities, then loss of forest cover by deforestation, and inefficient soil and water management. These are the indirect factors which can contribute to the drought situation. According to Susan Mayhew is a scholar. According to her, it is the long continuous period of dry weather that is taken as a drought, and drought can also be defined as the natural availability of water when it is below the average, that is known as the drought. And the most prolonged drought in the history has been that of the Atacama desert in Chile, where people suffered around 400 years. There was drought and very less or negligible rainfall. Now let us see what are the types of the droughts. Meteorological drought, which is nothing but the rainfall which has become scarce. Rainfall is scanty and it is below average, and because of that it results into drought. Then hydrological drought, that is decreasing level of the reserve of water, that is in the reservoirs aquifers and lakes. Aquifers include the underground water, we can say, which is maybe below the rocks in the form of the water table, or held in between the gravel and sand particle below the earth's surface, and that water reserve is called as the aquifer, from where we can pump out the water by drilling the bore wells. And of course, this kind of decrease is due to the over exploitation of the water, over extraction of the water from the bore wells, and that leads to hydrological drought, and using extensively the water from the reservoir for the irrigation and all, when we increase our agricultural activities, and that also indirectly lead to hydrological drought. Next is the agricultural drought or agriculture drought. That is shortage of water availability to grow the crops, and this is because we are expanding our agriculture lands and increase irrigation activity. So ultimately the available water will become scarce. Now let us look into some data about the droughts. You can see in the picture how the surface of the earth appears when there is a drought due to the evaporation of water from the soil. Soil breaks up. Here there are some data collected, just let us go through. In 1540, in Central Europe, there was drought for 11 months. There was no rain for about 11 months. So people have suffered. People might have migrated from that place to some other place. In 1900 in India, drought killed somewhere between 25,000 to 3.25 million people, and that is the devastating drought in India. In 1928 to 30, in northwest Chile, around 3 million deaths by famine have been reported. Famine, as I have told you, people dying out because of unavailability of the food and water. So in 2006 to 2011, if you take up the eastern part of the Africa, around 50,000 to 1,50,000 people are reported to have died because of the drought and famine. So see how serious problem is this. So we have to think of avoiding the drought, finding the solutions to see that such natural calamities should no more affect human life. Now, what are the effects of the drought? Let us enlist. So it is directly affecting our economy and our social life, as well as the agriculture product. Mainly those countries which are depending on the agriculture products, they will be badly hit, their economy will be hit, and the people will suffer. Drought leads to famine. Let us define famine. Again, according to the scholar Susan Mayhew, that famine is a relatively sudden flare-up of mass death by starvation, usually relatively localized and usually associated with sharp rise in food prices. So that is another reason, when there is a shortage of food supply, demand increases and prices of the food will be rocketing, and when the prices become very high, poor people cannot afford, and due to unavailability of the food, they will be suffering from starvation, malnutrition and death. Droughts and famine can cause death of millions of people. People may also have to migrate from that area in search of the new place where food and water may be available. And even the loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, and the crops, these are also the effect of the drought, because inavailability of the water is what leading to the death of the plants, and forest may be drying out, and the habitats of the wild nature that may be destroyed, and biodiversity is affected, and even the crop production. Acute shortage of the drinking water, forest fire, and other effects we can take up of the drought. Acute shortage of the drinking water. That means drinking water is available to us in very minimum quantity, below the level of the required amount. And this happens because the lakes, rivers are drying out because of the drought, because of the high temperature. There are no rains, and people have to walk long distances in search of the water, and that is how the drought affects the human life. And during the drought, even due to the dry and hot climatical conditions, when the tree branches rub onto each other, forest fire may erupt, and that may cause a huge destruction of the natural resources, forests, as well as the wildlife. Now, long-term droughts, if you take up, they can have the effect on the ecosystem in long run. Problems of drought can be resolved with proper water management practices and protecting the forest cover. The other ways how we can fight with this problem is developing crops by biotechnology, the crops which can grow in the hot climatical condition, in a very minimum availability of water, in shortage of water also they can thrive well, and these are called as the plants resistant to the environmental stresses. And such kind of genetically modified plants have been developed now, which can grow in such dry weather conditions, and also give us the food in the form of the grains and pulses. So that is one way how we can fight with the drought conditions and see that people should not die because of the starvation. Then conflicts over water is one of the burning issue, because whenever there is a scarcity of water, the available water will be shared by the different countries or different states in a country, and especially when the rivers are in between the districts of a state, or in between two states, or in between two nations, there the problem arises that whoever tries to build a dam, he will be storing the water, that country will be getting the water, and the another country will be suffering from scarcity of water. So then there will be fight or conflict between the two countries over the water resources, and that is what going to happen in future. Approximately 214 rivers in the world flow across different nations. So that means they are shared by different nations. Such rivers are called as intercontinental rivers. Hence, construction of dams by one country can deprive the other from the water, as I have told you. After the 1974 there was a conflict between India and Pakistan because the rivers like Satluj River and Beas, these are the common rivers for these two countries, and India had to share the water of these rivers with the neighboring country. Similarly, the conflict was also there for the river Ganga and Brahmaputra, and the Indian government has to allow the neighboring countries also to use the water from Ganga and Brahmaputra. Similarly, in America and Mexico, there was a conflict over Colorado and Rio Grande water. These are the two major rivers, and these rivers are now shared between these two parts of the America. Among Middle East, similarly, Tigris and Euphrates are the rivers which run across the Middle East, crossing the Jordan, Syria, Iraq and Turkey. So all these countries have to share this water, and there was a conflict between these countries, and the problem was resolved by sharing the water of these rivers equally. According to the United Nations Development Programme report, the main conflict in Africa during the next 25 years could be over water. That is what the UNDP is expecting, because the water resources are slowly becoming scarcer and scarcer. Now, potential water wars are likely in areas where river and lakes are shared by more than one countries. So that is quite obvious. Agriculture, as we know, is the biggest user of the water in Africa as well as Asia. The countries who are mainly depending on their agriculture product, so there the utilization of the water from the water resources, rivers, lakes and ponds is very much. And according to some scholars, approximately 1000 tons of water is needed to produce 1 ton of grains. 1000 times more water is needed. So we can imagine how important the water is and the water resources are for production of the food for the people of the country, and also for the purpose of export to other countries. In coming years, many countries may fight among themselves. They may fight among themselves on the issues of the rivers, especially wherever the rivers are intercontinental or international. According to Kofi Annan, acute competition to command water resources contains the seed of war. So very well said that the seed for the war, the reason for the wars in the future may be over the water resources. Now let us take up the benefits and problems in just. So according to Encyclopedia Britannica, structure built across a stream, a river or estuary to retain water is called dam. Estuary is a region where the river joins the ocean, where the salinity of water is in between. It's neither fresh water nor the seawater. The salinity is around 15 parts per million, whereas the salinity of the ocean is 35 parts per million, and salinity of the freshwater rivers, where very little salts or minerals are there, that is 5 parts per million. Okay, so these estuaries with 15 parts per million salinity, so these also are being utilized to build the dams preventing that water simply entering into the oceans. Now, all over the world, many countries give priority to the construction of dams. Why? In order to see that the dry land can be converted into agricultural fields by irrigation. And also, if we have the dams, the same water can be channelized to rotate the turbine in the hydroelectric power stations to generate electricity. Then dams in fact play a very significant role in socio-economic progress of any country. Without them, India would have been thirsty, hungry and dark land, ravaged with floods and droughts every year. So that means, as because we the Indians have got so many dams built over the rivers, and this water is wisely utilized for the irrigation and for so many other purposes, and our socio-economic progress has been possible through these ways. Otherwise, India being the agricultural country by large, so we would have suffered very badly. Now let us look into one of the quotation given by the once Prime Minister, late Jawaharlal Nehru. He says that architect of modern India called dams are actually temples of modern India. So according to him, the architect of modern India are dams only, and dams are like the temples of modern India, because dams have provided us the means of irrigation and plenty of food we are able to grow, and the fight with the hunger and poverty has been attained through this program. So therefore we can say that we the Indians now are self-reliant in case of the food production, and a huge amount of food grains we are exporting also. Now, adverse effects of dam. There are some adverse effects, of course, of the dams. Let's see what these are. It causes microclimatic changes in the area wherever vast amount of water is contained in the reservoir or the dam. That area, if you look at the climatical changes takes place, that is called as microclimate. And then the destruction of forest when we are constructing the dam, huge amount of forest area will be submerging, and that is nothing but habitat loss for the wild organisms, so biodiversity is affected. Then displacement of the people, especially the tribal community, and that's also another effect of the dams. The thousands and thousands of people have to migrate from their home, that is the forest area and nearby villages, to some other places for inhabitation. Then waterlogging, when the water gets stagnant in the area, in the land area, and because of the nature of the soil, it is not getting percolated, like clay soil cannot allow much water to pass through it, so water logging takes place, water remains stagnant in the soil, and that will not allow the roots of the plants to get enough oxygen, and that is how the plants may die out. And not only that, waterlogging also increase the salinity of the land and making that land unfit for growth of the plants. But these can be very well managed by proper scientific methods. That's all, friends. We'll meet in another video lecture.